So here's what's actually happening right now. The United States and Israel launched a massive military campaign against Iran on February 28, 2026. They killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei in the opening strikes. The war has now been going on for nearly 4 weeks, and over 1,500 people have been killed in Iran alone, including more than 1,300 civilians. The region is in absolute chaos. Oil prices have surged past $100 a barrel. The Strait of Hormuz is under threat of closure. And right in the middle of all this, there's a question that keeps coming up in Washington, in Jerusalem, and in newsrooms around the world. Will Donald Trump team up with Kurdish forces to open a ground front inside Iran? Let me tell you exactly what's happening with this Kurdish angle, because it's one of the most fascinating and dangerous developments of this entire conflict. Just 6 days before the war even started, something remarkable happened. 5 Iranian Kurdish opposition groups that had been operating separately for decades suddenly decided to unite. On February 22, 2026, they formed what they called the Coalition of Political Forces of Iranian Kurdistan. This wasn't a coincidence. They knew something was coming. These groups include the Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iran, which is the oldest and most established Kurdish party in the region, along with the Kurdistan Freedom Party known as PAK, the Kurdistan Free Life Party called PJAK, and 2 smaller groups named Kabat and Kamala. Each of these groups has their own fighters, their own history, and their own complicated relationships with regional powers. Now here's where things get really interesting. Within days of the war starting, Donald Trump personally got on the phone with Kurdish leaders. According to multiple reports, he spoke with Masoud Barzani and Bafel Talabani, the leaders of the 2 main Kurdish factions in Iraqi Kurdistan. He also reportedly spoke with Mustafa Hijri, the head of the Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iran. These weren't casual conversations. Trump was actively exploring whether Kurdish forces could serve as a ground component in the war against Iran. The logic behind this makes a certain kind of brutal sense. If you're trying to topple the Iranian regime through airstrikes alone, you're going to hit a wall eventually. Military analysts have been saying for years that you cannot achieve regime change from the sky. Bombs can destroy buildings and kill commanders, but they cannot hold territory. They cannot secure cities. They cannot prevent a government from continuing to function as long as loyal forces remain intact. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is a parallel military structure specifically designed to protect the regime. Unless you have boots on the ground, the body survives even after you cut off the head. So who do you turn to? The United States isn't going to send in American soldiers for a ground invasion of Iran. That's politically impossible. The American public has no appetite for another Iraq or Afghanistan. They're not going to watch their sons and daughters die in the mountains of western Iran for a war they barely understand. But what if there was already a force on the ground, a group of people who have been fighting the Iranian regime for decades, who know the terrain, who have combat experience, who are motivated by their own grievances and who are willing to do the fighting themselves? That's where the Kurds come in. The Kurdish people are one of the largest ethnic groups in the world without their own country. Somewhere between 30 and 45 million Kurds are scattered across Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Their homeland was carved up after World War I when the Ottoman Empire collapsed and Western powers drew new borders with no consideration for Kurdish aspirations. The Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 basically erased any hope of a Kurdish state, and since then, they've been minorities in countries that have often treated them with suspicion, hostility, or outright brutality. In Iran specifically, there are somewhere between 10 and 15 million Kurds living primarily in 4 provinces along the northwestern border: Kurdistan, West Azerbaijan, Kermanshah, and Elam. They speak their own language, have their own culture, and have a long history of resistance against the Iranian government. The Islamic Republic has never trusted them. Kurdish activists have been arrested, tortured, and executed. Kurdish regions have been economically neglected. And for decades, armed Kurdish groups have been fighting a low-level insurgency against Iranian security forces. Now think about this from Trump and Netanyahu's perspective. Here you have thousands of fighters who are already trained, already armed to some degree, already hostile to Tehran, and positioned right along the border between Iraq and Iran. The Iraqi Kurdish region which has been semi-autonomous since the 1991 Gulf War, serves as a base for many of these Iranian Kurdish opposition groups. They've been sheltering there, training there, planning there. Some of them have combat experience from fighting ISIS alongside American forces. The Kurdistan Freedom Party, for example, received training from American military instructors during the campaign against the Islamic State. These aren't amateurs. According to reports from CNN, the CIA has been negotiating with multiple Kurdish groups about potentially arming them to spark an uprising inside Iran. The plan, which apparently originated with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the Mossad, was to use Kurdish forces as a catalyst for regime change. The idea was that if you could get armed Kurds crossing into Iran, combined with the massive airstrikes degrading Iranian military infrastructure, combined with the economic collapse and the popular protests that were already happening, you might trigger a cascade that brings down the entire system. There's evidence that this plan was already being put into motion. According to Israeli media, US and Israeli warplanes specifically targeted Revolutionary Guard Corps positions along the Iran-Iraq border in the opening days of the war. They hit border guard installations, internal security headquarters, and intelligence facilities across Sanandaj, Kermanshah, Mahabad, and other Kurdish cities. By March 7th, over 40 security sites in Sanandaj alone had been destroyed. These strikes weren't random. They were designed to create a corridor to degrade Iran's ability to prevent Kurdish opposition groups from crossing into Iranian territory. And the Kurds themselves were preparing. According to an official from the Coalition of Political Forces of Iranian Kurdistan, fighters affiliated with PJAK began taking combat positions inside Iranian territory starting on March 2nd, just 2 days after the war began. Iranian forces reportedly evacuated the border city of Marwan and began establishing defensive positions. There were reports of thousands of Kurdish fighters being inside Iran by the first week of the conflict. But then something strange happened. Trump backed off. On March 7th and 8th, after initially expressing support for Kurdish involvement, Trump suddenly changed his tune. He said he did not want Kurdish fighters to enter the war against Iran. He said the conflict was complicated enough already. He said he didn't want to see Kurds get hurt or killed. He told reporters on Air Force One that he had ruled out having Kurds go in, even though they had told him they were willing. What happened? Why the sudden reversal? The answer involves one of America's oldest and most complicated alliances, Turkey. Turkey is a NATO member. It hosts American military bases. It has one of the largest armies in the alliance, and it is absolutely terrified of Kurdish empowerment anywhere in the region. For Turkey, the Kurdish issue isn't some distant geopolitical abstraction. It's an existential threat. The Kurdistan Workers' Party, known as the PKK, has been fighting an armed insurgency against the Turkish state since 1984. Over 40,000 people have died in that conflict. The PKK is designated as a terrorist organization by Turkey, the United States, and the European Union. Now here's the problem. One of the main Iranian Kurdish groups that Washington was reportedly talking to, PJAK, is directly affiliated with the PKK. They share ideology, they share fighters, they share infrastructure in the Kandil Mountains along the Iran-Iraq-Turkey border. From Ankara's perspective, arming PJAK is basically the same as arming the PKK. It's helping an organization that has spent decades trying to carve territory out of Turkey. President Erdogan moved quickly. Turkish officials pushed back hard against any American or Israeli effort to arm Iranian Kurdish groups. Reports emerged that Turkey was even discussing potential military intervention if Kurdish forces gained ground along its border. One Turkish official was quoted saying that if anything on the Iranian Kurdish front threatens Turkish security, Turkey will respond with force. This put Washington in an incredibly difficult position. Yes, Kurdish fighters could potentially be useful ground forces against Iran, but Turkey is a NATO ally with enormous strategic value. Turkey controls access to the Black Sea. Turkey hosts American nuclear weapons. Turkey is critical to any number of regional calculations. And Erdogan was making it very clear that empowering Kurdish groups was a red line. So Trump pulled back, at least publicly. But let's think about what actually happens if the US does decide to use Kurdish forces anyway, whether openly or covertly. What are the implications? What could go wrong? First, there's the question of whether Kurdish forces can actually accomplish anything militarily. The combined strength of all Iranian Kurdish opposition groups is probably somewhere between 5 and 10,000 fighters. That's not nothing, but Iran has over 500,000 active military personnel, plus the IRGC, plus various paramilitary forces. Even with American air cover, Kurdish fighters would be vastly outnumbered. They don't have heavy weapons. They don't have armor. They don't have the logistics to sustain a large-scale offensive. Kurdish officials themselves have been clear about this. They've been asking for a no-fly zone similar to what protected Iraqi Kurds after the 1991 Gulf War. They've been saying that without air cover, any ground operation would be suicidal. Iran may have lost a lot of its long-range missile capability in the opening strikes, but it still has formidable short-range weapons that could devastate Kurdish fighters operating near the border. One PJAK official was quoted saying that they've been trying to convey to American contacts that their move cannot lead to a massacre of their own people. These aren't naive militants rushing headlong into battle. They understand the risks. They remember what happened to Kurds in Iraq when Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons against them at Halabja. They remember being abandoned again and again by American administrations that found them useful one moment and disposable the next. Which brings us to maybe the most important point: the history of American betrayals of the Kurds. This isn't the first time the United States has encouraged Kurdish fighters to rise up against a hostile regime. It isn't even the second or third time. Some analysts have counted at least 8 distinct instances over the past century where America built up Kurdish hopes, used them for various strategic purposes, and then abandoned them when circumstances changed. In 1975, the Shah of Iran suddenly signed a peace agreement with Saddam Hussein and withdrew support for Iraqi Kurdish rebels that the US had been backing. America followed Tehran's lead and cut off assistance, causing the rebellion to collapse and leaving Kurds exposed to Saddam's brutal retaliation. In 1991, President George H.W. Bush encouraged Kurds and Shiites to rise up against Saddam after the Gulf War. They did. Saddam responded with helicopter gunships and massacres. America didn't intervene. In 2017, Iraqi Kurds held an independence referendum that passed overwhelmingly. The US opposed it. When Baghdad sent troops, backed by Iranian allied militias, to retake Kirkuk and other disputed territories, America did nothing. And then there's 2019, Trump's first term. Syrian Kurds had fought alongside American forces against ISIS for years. They liberated Raqqa. They took enormous casualties. And then Trump made a phone call with Erdogan and announced the withdrawal of American forces, effectively greenlighting a Turkish invasion of Kurdish-controlled territory in northeastern Syria. Kurdish fighters who had been American allies just days before were suddenly getting bombed by a NATO member. The images of American convoys driving away while locals threw rotten vegetables at them remain burned into Kurdish memory. There's a famous Kurdish saying, "We have no friends but the mountains." It captures the bitter wisdom of a people who have learned through repeated painful experience that great powers use them as tools and discard them when they're no longer needed. So when Trump calls Kurdish leaders and tells them he supports their fight against Iran, when CIA officers meet with opposition figures to discuss potential arms transfers, when Israeli intelligence builds relationships with Kurdish networks, there's an understandable skepticism on the Kurdish side. They've heard these promises before, they've believed them before, and they've paid the price before. But desperation can override historical memory. The protests in Iran that began in late 2025 showed that the regime is vulnerable. The death of Khamenei created genuine uncertainty about the future. For Kurdish activists who have spent their entire lives dreaming of freedom, this moment might seem too important to pass up. Even if America might betray them again, what's the alternative? Continue living under a government that persecutes them? Watch this opportunity slip away and wonder what might have been. Now let's consider what happens in the broader region if Kurdish forces do play a significant role in weakening or collapsing the Iranian regime. Turkey would view this as a catastrophe, not because Erdogan loves the Islamic Republic, but because an empowered Kurdish movement in Iran would energize Kurdish aspirations everywhere. Kurdish fighters in Iran would have just demonstrated that armed resistance can work. Kurdish populations in Turkey, Syria, and Iraq would be watching. The PKK's peace process with Ankara, which has been sputtering along for years, would likely collapse entirely. Turkey might launch military operations into Iranian territory just to prevent Kurdish gains from consolidating. Iraq is equally complicated. The Iraqi government has repeatedly warned Iranian Kurdish groups not to use Iraqi territory as a launching pad for attacks on Iran. Baghdad has agreements with Tehran. Iranian-backed Shiite militias are major players in Iraqi politics. If Kurdish fighters cross from Iraqi Kurdistan into Iran, Iraq gets dragged into the war whether it wants to or not. Iran has already been striking targets in Iraqi Kurdistan, and that will only intensify. Syria, which just went through its own transformation with the fall of Assad, is watching nervously. Syrian Kurds built an autonomous region in the northeast during the civil war, but they're now under pressure from the new Syrian government. Israeli support for Kurdish groups in the region has already created tensions. If the Iran war expands Kurdish influence, Syrian Kurds might see an opportunity, but they might also face retaliation. And then there's the question of what happens inside Iran itself if the regime collapses. Iran isn't just Persians. It's a multinational state. Kurds are maybe 15% of the population. Azerbaijanis are another 20% or more. There are Arabs, Baluchis, Turkmen, and other minority groups. If Kurdish forces carve out territory in the northwest, what happens in other regions? Do Baluchi separatists in the southeast see an opportunity? Do Arab populations in the oil-rich southwest start thinking about their own autonomy? The nightmare scenario, which plenty of analysts have been warning about, is Syria but worse. A country of 90 million people fragmenting along ethnic and sectarian lines. IRGC factions fighting to hold on to power. Religious extremists exploiting the chaos. And at the center of it all, an unknown quantity of enriched uranium and ballistic missile technology. Iran isn't Iraq or Libya. It's much bigger, much more capable, and much more dangerous if it falls apart uncontrollably. Some analysts argue that this concern is overblown. Iran has a strong national identity, Persians and Azerbaijanis, who together make up a majority of the population, have centuries of shared history. Unlike Iraq, where Sunnis and Shiites were artificially thrown together by colonial borders, Iran is an ancient civilization with deep cultural cohesion. The collapse of the Islamic Republic wouldn't necessarily mean the collapse of the Iranian state. But others point to the Revolutionary Guards. The IRGC isn't just a military force. It's a state within a state. It controls ports, banks, and oil fields. It has its own economy, its own ideology, its own power structure. If the clerical regime falls, IRGC commanders might carve out their own fiefdoms rather than simply surrender power. You could end up with multiple armed factions, each controlling different parts of the country, each fighting for resources and influence. This is why Trump's approach to the Kurdish question matters so much. If he's serious about using them as ground forces, he needs to think about what comes after. Does Washington have a plan for a post-regime Iran? Is there a political framework that can incorporate Kurdish aspirations without triggering fragmentation? Are there guarantees that would prevent Turkey from intervening? Is there any way to avoid repeating the mistakes of Iraq, Libya, and Syria? The honest answer, based on everything we've seen so far, is that there doesn't seem to be a plan. The war started with airstrikes. The messaging has been chaotic. Trump has gone back and forth on Kurdish involvement within days. There's no clear political endgame, no framework for what victory looks like, no realistic assessment of how to manage the aftermath. And the Kurds themselves are aware of this. They've been having internal debates about how much to trust American promises. Some groups, like PJAK, have been more cautious, saying they won't move unless they get concrete guarantees of air cover and political support. Others, like PAK, have been more aggressive, claiming they've already stepped up operations inside Iran. The coalition they formed in February was supposed to present a united front, but the underlying divisions haven't gone away. There's also disagreement about goals. Some Kurdish parties are fighting for independence, for a state of their own, carved out of Iranian territory. Others are more realistic, seeking autonomy within a reformed Iranian system, similar to what Iraqi Kurds have achieved. These different objectives create tensions within the coalition. If you're negotiating with America, what are you negotiating for? What counts as success? Israel adds another layer of complexity. Israeli intelligence has had relationships with Kurdish groups for decades, going back to the periphery doctrine of the 1960s, when Israel sought alliances with non-Arab populations on the margins of hostile Arab states. Netanyahu reportedly pushed hard for American engagement with Iranian Kurds. But Israel's interests aren't necessarily aligned with Kurdish interests. Israel wants to weaken Iran. It might be perfectly happy with chaos inside Iran that prevents the regime from projecting power. Whether Kurdish populations actually achieve meaningful self-determination is secondary to Israeli strategic calculations. This is one of the bitter truths of geopolitics. Small nations and stateless peoples get used. Their aspirations become tools in larger conflicts. The Kurds have experienced this repeatedly. They know that American support comes with strings attached and expiration dates. They know that Israel cares about Iran's nuclear program more than Kurdish rights. They know that their position on the map, straddling the borders of 4 hostile states, makes them permanently vulnerable. And yet they keep fighting. They keep organizing. They keep hoping that this time will be different. Because what else can they do? The Iranian regime has given them nothing but persecution. The prospect of freedom, however uncertain, is better than accepting permanent subjugation. There's something deeply human about this. People who have been denied dignity for generations don't calculate risk-reward ratios like economists. They act from a sense of identity and justice that transcends pragmatic considerations. Kurdish fighters aren't naive about the dangers they face. They're willing to accept those dangers because the alternative is unbearable. But that doesn't mean Washington should exploit their willingness. There's a moral responsibility that comes with encouraging people to risk their lives for strategic purposes. If you're going to use Kurdish fighters as proxies in your war against Iran, you need to be prepared to support them afterward. You need to have thought through the implications. You need to be honest about what you're offering and what you're not. Based on Trump's track record, none of that is likely to happen. This is the president who abandoned Syrian Kurds with a phone call. This is the president whose foreign policy is characterized by impulsive decisions and transactional thinking. There's no reason to believe he's developed a newfound commitment to Kurdish welfare. So where does this leave us? The war in Iran continues. Airstrikes are still happening every day. Iranian missiles are still hitting targets in Israel, Saudi Arabia, and across the Gulf. The economic damage is staggering, with oil prices spiking and global supply chains disrupted. Casualties are mounting on all sides. The Kurdish factor remains unresolved. Trump has publicly backed off from Kurdish involvement, but nobody believes that's the final word. If the air campaign fails to produce regime change, if the Iranian government proves more resilient than expected, the pressure to find ground forces will intensify. Kurdish fighters are still the most obvious option. The question is whether Washington will be honest about what it's asking them to do and what it's prepared to offer in return. For the Kurds themselves, this is a moment of profound uncertainty. Some see it as the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to finally break free from Iranian oppression while the regime is weakened and distracted. Others see a trap, another chance to get used and discarded by great powers pursuing their own interests. The debates within Kurdish communities are intense and ongoing. What's clear is that whatever happens, the Kurdish people will bear a disproportionate share of the consequences. If they join the fight and succeed, Turkey will move to crush any gains they make. If they join the fight and fail, Iran will exact brutal revenge. If they stay on the sidelines, they might miss their best chance in decades to change their circumstances. It's an impossible position, and it's one the Kurds have found themselves in throughout their history. Caught between empires, used as proxies, promised much and delivered little. The mountains remain their only reliable ally. The coming weeks will reveal whether Trump's administration has any real strategy for dealing with the Kurdish question, or whether it's just another improvised tactical move in a war that has already spiraled beyond anyone's control. Either way, The Kurds will be watching, hoping, and preparing for the possibility that once again, they'll have to face their enemies alone. This is the reality of the Middle East in 2026. Wars that start as targeted strikes evolve into regional conflagrations. Alliances shift with presidential phone calls. Ancient peoples without states become pawns in contests between nuclear powers. And somewhere in the mountains between Iran and Iraq, Kurdish fighters are cleaning their weapons and wondering whether this time, finally, the world will remember them when the shooting stops. The answer to that question will shape the future of the entire region, because if the Kurds succeed in carving out meaningful autonomy, it will inspire similar movements everywhere. If they fail, it will confirm once again that for stateless peoples, the international system offers nothing but betrayal. And if their involvement triggers a wider war with Turkey or a collapse of Iran into warring factions, then the consequences will be measured not in years but in generations. Trump asked the Kurds if they wanted to fight. They said yes. Now the question is whether anyone in Washington has thought about what happens next.